So when we think of a block, along with all its flexible markup, so that special comment tag with the JSON blob for the attributes, and then the inner HTML elements and the nested structure of those blocks, in essence, we have two representations of a block. The canonical representation lives within the post content. So that's something that we saw in the code editor view of the post. This is then taken and rendered out as HTML on the site output. As we saw for an image block, there is a bit of dynamic thing happening for converting or generating the dynamic source sets for the responsive sizes. Now, when we look at the editor, however, we need to now have controls. So that image size selector that we saw on the inspector on the right-hand side panel, that now needs to be populated somehow. So the same block that is eventually stored in the database and rendered out as HTML needs to have a representation in the JavaScript land in that block editor. So we're using this concept of block lifecycle to represent how the block gets parsed from the markup and rendered to the output, but also the same block content gets parsed and converted into this mini JavaScript application that the block editor is. So the block attributes, all its inner content, everything like that is now in the realm or control of this front-end tooling that we have. So in order to sync up the drop-down to the actual attribute value, we use the React framework. And that in turn, whenever it's done processing, when we're done updating our preview of the block output, is eventually serialized or saved back to the same post content. So this synchronization is a new requirement for the kind of ideal experience of a block. So from the WordPress user editing the site and working with our blocks, giving them the controls, right? The utensils essentially within the editor to kind of configure and have easy ways to specify those block attributes. Now, whenever it's stored, then it needs to be prepared for the rendering. As we saw in case of static blocks, a lot of that markup for the rendering comes from what is in the block content, in the post content itself. Now we can introduce dynamic blocks where all of that is 100% generated for the output, such as the site title that we saw. So combined, this is the new framework as how the blocks work and exist in the WordPress ecosystem. Throughout the next lessons, we'll learn the actual tooling that we can use to adjust these controls. So give the drop-down selectors, provide all kinds of inline controls for the blocks, make sure that the block editing experience is equally great as the consumption of the blocks, the eventual output, right? The layout, the unique designs that we're trying to achieve. Throughout the shareable tokens that we already touched upon in the earlier lessons for the themes, we are now able to reuse them for our blocks as well, like we saw with the things that the block supports does by inheriting the global attributes. So a lot to do with the formatting, the visual aspect of that is something that WordPress core already takes care of. There are also obviously some gaps that are still being worked on, but WordPress is ever evolving. So whenever you're developing your block, consider it its own little island that still needs to fit in this wider ecosystem of blocks. And that composability, that your block is probably going to be part of a group block, or it's going to be left aligned along with an image or something like that. So this block lifecycle from the markup that is stored in the database to whatever we're editing in the block editor and eventually returning in the output is the new era of the WordPress development. This is where a lot of the exciting new features are happening. Some people obviously say that this is a lot of complications. And we have to agree that a lot of this state management, this kind of visual synchronization between the attributes and the visual representation of those attributes is something that we did not have to care earlier. But modern applications require that they are friendly tools to users. And this kind of what you see is what you get type of experience, but in a true sense, not the kind of the legacy, the classic editor way of WordPress is the new expectation. It is the new standard that other CMSs and other commercial and open source tools are embracing. So WordPress has had a head start with this. The framework that we saw and discussed in these lessons today is now available for us to build upon and use for creating rich and great experiences for our users. So throughout the next lessons, we'll see how we can build and extend existing blocks through basic styling up to a completely custom blocks that we create. I can't wait to see what you build.